Okay, so this passage, again, as well as having a title, which is Adultery, it's also got a little summary of the passage. So Julia and Sempronius Gracchus are punished by Tiberius for adultery. And then there's also a translation in italics of the bit of Latin just before the passage begins. So that is, Julia, daughter of the Emperor Augustus, was first married to Marcellus, who died at a young age. So now we go into the Latin. So deinde, meaning then or next. Julia is the name Julia, and it is probably nominative here. That would make sense at the beginning of a sentence and a passage. Then, if you look for the main verb, it is nupsit. And if you look this up, you'll find it comes from the verb nubo, which means to be married to someone. And because it's a verb that is used of women, and so it has this kind of passive meaning, a meaning of being married to somebody. And that's why it takes the dative case. So hence Marco Agrippae is dative case. And what you need to remember there is just to put his name back into the nominative form when you translate it into English. So Julia married, or was married to, Marcus Agrippa. Now, after the semicolon, you have this word cuius, which is the genitive singular form of the pronoun qui, quae, quod. And remember, if you have that pronoun, that relative pronoun, coming at the beginning of a phrase or sentence, so after not just a comma, but a semicolon or a colon or a full stop, then it is what is called a connecting relative. And that means that it refers back to someone from the previous sentence or phrase, but we translate it not as who, but as he, she, it. Something like that. So you translate it as if it was from the pronoun is, ea, id. So for example, instead of cuius, we translate it as if it were eius. So cuius means of whom, or of him, or of her, or of it. Then post mortem means after death. So after the death of somebody. And this would refer back to the most recent singular noun, which is Marcus Agrippa. So after his death, referring to Marcus Agrippa, a patre Augusto. So in Latin, if you have a plus an ablative name, it usually means by that person. So by her father Augustus. And then you have tradita est. Now, if you look up traditus, you'll see it's the PPP from trado, to hand over. So this is perfect passive, right? PPP plus the singular, plus the present tense of sum. So she was handed over, right? And then Tiberio is dative or ablative. And in this case, it's only really the dative that will make sense. So by her father Augustus, she was handed over to Tiberius. So she was handed over by her father Augustus to Tiberius. Qui, who, and this will refer to the most recent noun that it could agree with, so that's Tiberius, because qui is masculine singular and Tiberius is masculine singular. So who, and then we look for our main verb, which is at the end here, coactus est. And if you can't remember coactus, you can look it up. You'll see that it's the PPP from cogere, which is to force or compel, right? And just like with tradita est, you've got the PPP plus the present tense of sum, and that makes it perfect passive. So who was forced, and just like in English, that will be followed by an infinitive, was forced to do something, and the infinitive is repudiare, meaning to repudiate or reject or divorce, and that will also need an object, which will be suam uxorem, his wife. So the whole phrase means who was forced to divorce his wife. Then, in the next phrase, postquam. Now, postquam means after something happened. So just remember the difference between three very similar words. So post plus accusative means after a thing, So it's followed by a noun, like post canam, after dinner. Then you've got post quam, which is followed by a verb, so after something happened. And then you've got postea, Postea, which means afterwards. So it's just worth separating those out in your mind. So in this case, we have after plus a verb. So after Tiberius, so he's going to be the subject because he's nominative. The main verb will be duxit, so that means he led. And the object is eam, which means her. And if you're not sure about that, just do a bit of revision of the pronoun is, ea, id, because this is the feminine accusative singular of that pronoun. So after Tiberius led her in matrimonium, into marriage. Or you could just translate this as after Tiberius married her, because it's the same idea. Sempronius Gracchus, comma, vir nobilis, comma. So this phrase vir nobilis is in between commas, so it's just giving us a little bit more detail about the man. So Sempronius Gracchus, a noble man. Qui, so this will refer to him, to Sempronius Gracchus, who. And then cum, remember cum in Latin, there's two different meanings. One is if it's followed by an ablative noun or pronoun, then it means with. The other is if it's followed by a subjunctive verb, and then it means when or since. So have a look in this instance, you do have an ablative noun just after it, Julia, whereas you don't have a subjunctive verb. So with Julia, stuprum is accusative case, so it must be the object of something. So we look for our main verb, which is fecerat. So feci is the perfect tense, the third principal part of the verb facio. And if you look at the ending erat, this is the pluperfect tense. So remember, the pluperfect is formed from the perfect stem plus eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratis, erant. So who had done stuprum, adultery, or we could say had committed adultery, with Julia, cum Julia, vivo Agrippa. Now notice vivo, that O at the end, that's ablative from the adjective vivus, and Agrippa is also ablative here. So with Agrippa alive. It's sort of an ablative absolute, except that it's an adjective instead of a participle. So with Agrippa alive, or you might say while Agrippa was still alive. So who had committed adultery with Julia while Agrippa was alive? Now A, if you look that up in if you'd look it up in a sort of a grammar reference, really, because A comes from the pronoun is, ea, id. And again, that's a really important one to know. But if you look at the table of that pronoun, you'll see that A is the dative singular. So it means to him, or to her, or to it. So you've got to think, well, why is it dative? And the answer comes in the very next word, because persuasit, this is the perfect from persuadeo, persuadere, to persuade, and that verb, persuadeo, always takes dative. Right? In English, you persuade somebody, but in Latin, you persuade to or for somebody, right? They go in the dative case. So he persuaded her, and then what follows, right? If you persuade somebody to do something, what follows is an indirect command. Just like if you order someone to do something. And an indirect command in Latin is typically expressed by ut plus subjunctive. So he persuaded her ut sperneret, to reject. And then the object of that would be maritum, her husband, which is in the accusative case. So he persuaded her to reject her husband. Okay, then we go to the next phrase. Now, litterae. Now, one littera is a letter, like a letter of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, and so on. But plural, in the plural, litterae means a letter in the sense of a message that you write down and send to someone. So literae in the plural is a synonym of the word epistula. So it's plural, but we translate it as singular. A letter. And then we look for our main verb. It comes at the end of the phrase, missai sunt. Right, so you've got, so missus, this is the PPP from mittere, to send. Right, so notice again, you've got the PPP and then the present tense of sum, so that's perfect passive. A letter was sent. Ab Julia, remember ab plus ablative with a person means by that person. So a letter was sent by Julia ad patrem Augustum, to her father Augustus. In quibus, in plus ablative, in which, and you notice that quibus is plural because it's referring back to the literae, in which Tiberium, now notice here, we can't use Tiberius as the subject because he has an accusative ending. So the subject must be presumably she, Julia, in which she, insectabat, was criticizing, and then Tiberius will be the object. So in which she was criticizing Tiberius. Okay, next phrase. Now, has comes from the pronoun hic, haec, hoc, which is another one that's really important that you know. It is feminine accusative singular. Feminine accusative plural, rather. And so you need to be thinking, okay, what feminine plural noun have we got here that this would refer to? And there's only one feminine plural noun in this whole section, which is literae, the letter. So this letter, has, right, it's referring to the letter, but it's also the object, right? So you need to park it for a moment, leave it for a moment, and think, okay, who's the subject here? Well, the subject is multi, many people. And then the verb is credebant, which is the imperfect tense. So many believed. And then you've got to think, what construction comes after the verb credere? And the answer is indirect statement, right? Because you believe that something is the case. And an indirect statement is expressed by accusative and infinitive. So the accusative is has, and the infinitive is scriptas esse, which is a perfect passive infinitive, meaning to have been written, right? You've got your PPP plus esse, to have been written. So many believed that these letters had been written, scriptas esse, by Gracchus. Again, a plus an ablative person means by that person. So many believed that these, or in other words, that this letter had been written by Gracchus. It might be better actually to say this rather than these, since we translate the letter as singular in English. But anyway, so there we are. Next sentence, Julia vero, Julia indeed. And then what you notice here, so spreto, you might not recognize that, but if you look it up, you will see that it comes from the verb sperno, spernere, which is to spurn or reject somebody. So the PPP is spretus. And if you look at the case, spreto, you think, that seems to be ablative, so I've got an ablative participle, and then I've got an ablative noun, marito. Ablative of maritus. So you've got to think, okay, this is probably an ablative absolute. So, with her new husband, having been rejected, ut impari. Now, ut, remember, a couple of different meanings. Ut plus subjunctive is going to mean in order to, or it could be part of a result clause or something. But if you have ut without a subjunctive verb, then it means as or when. And particularly ut plus an adjective means as something. So with her husband having been rejected as impari, unequal or inferior. In other words, she's rejected her new husband because he is inferior. Right? So with her new husband rejected as inferior, Non solum. Now, this is another idiom or sort of stock phrase that you need to learn. Non solum dot 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 sed etiam dot dot dot. And that means not only one thing, but also something else. So non solum, not only, sed etiam, but also. Quite a common phrase in Latin. So, not only Gracchus, but also multos alios viros, many other men. Now, this whole group, Gracchum and the multos alios viros, you need to notice the case. And the case is accusative. So these people are not doing anything, but they are the object. So, do we have a verb, do we have a nominative noun to be the subject here? No, we don't. So, the subject of the verb escapit must be Julia. Right, so Julia welcomed, escapit, or received, not only Gracchus, but also many other men in cubiculum suum, into her bedroom. And again, remember that in plus accusative is different from in plus ablative, right? So in cubiculo would mean in her bedroom, because that's ablative, but in cubiculum means into her bedroom, because that is accusative. Okay, next phrase, ergo, meaning therefore. A patre, so again, remember, a or ab plus an ablative person means by that person, so by her father. In exilium, again, in plus accusative, into exile. Ad parvam insulam, to a small island. And then finally we have the verb, missa est. Now, missus is the PPP from mittere, to send. And here you've got the PPP plus the present of sum. So that is perfect passive. So therefore, she was sent, and we know it's feminine because it's missa rather than missus. She was sent by her father into exile to a small island. In qua, on which, so qua is feminine because it's referring back to the island, the insula. So in which or on which she lived, habitabat, imperfect of habitare, alone, sola. And just be aware, by the way, of the difference between two quite similar verbs, or verbs that look similar, habeo, habere, and habito, habitare. So habeo is I have, but habito is I live. And so, for example, in the imperfect tense, habebat would be she was having, whereas habitabat is she was living. So just worth separating those two out in your mind. Ipse Tiberius, right? So Tiberius himself, and then you've got a this is a perfect active participle, adeptus, right? Because it comes from adipiskor, which is a deponent verb. Again, you can recognize those because when you see them in a dictionary or in a word list, they have that OR at the end rather than an O. So having obtained, and then the object will be imperium, which means power or authority. So having obtained power or authority. Now, eam means her. So it's from is id, and it's feminine accusative singular. So we know that Tiberius did something to her, but we need to now find the verb. And the verb is at the end here, reliquit, which is the perfect of relinquere, to leave behind. So he left her. Sine plus ablative means without hope. So sine, without. Ulaspe, so sine ulaspe, without any hope. Usque ad mortem. Usque ad means all the way to, so literally all the way to death, mortem. And then ibi we can translate with reliquit because it means there. So he left her there without any hope right up to her death. So the phrase usque ad mortem tells us that she lived there alone all the way up until she died. Then, Gracchus autem. Now, so autem can mean however, or moreover, or now, depending on the context. It doesn't matter too much. So ad insulam, to the island, and then the island is named Cercinam, so to the island of Cercina, and then missus is the PPP from mittere, so it means having been sent. So, but Gracchus, having been sent to the island of Cercina, and I think here autem is just included to signal the fact that the story is shifting now from Julia to Gracchus. So we're just shifting our attention here. But Gracchus, having been sent to the island of Cercina. Now, quatuor decim is 14, the number 14, and annos, notice, is accusative, plural. And so when you've got an accusative time phrase, it means for a certain amount of time. So for 14 years. And then the main verb here is ferebat. Now, it's important to remember here that fero has a couple of different meanings. Literally, it means to carry something, but it can also mean to endure something, to suffer something. And so in order to decide the meaning, you need to look at the object, which is exilium, exile. And of course, you can't physically carry exile, so it must be that second meaning, to endure or suffer. So for 14 years, he suffered exile, or he endured exile. Then, the soldiers, milites, and agreeing with that is missi, having been sent. And you can see that missi is nominative plural, so they must be the subject. The soldiers having been sent, ad eum interficiendum. Now remember, ad plus gerundive is a way of expressing purpose. So when you see ad and then this gerundive that you recognize from the nd in the middle of it, this is like a purpose clause, like ut interficerent. So sent to kill him, eum meaning him, the soldiers sent to kill him, and then our main verb is invenerunt, they found, and then the object is eum again, they found him, in litore, right? This is in plus ablative, meaning in or on. So they found him on the shore. And then in the next phrase, so quorum is genitive plural, so it means of whom. But this is, again, when you have the relative pronoun at the beginning of a clause, or, so after a colon or semicolon or full stop, we translate it as if it were from is, ea, id. So you can translate quorum like eorum, so of them. And then adventu is ablative of adventus. So adventus means arrival, and the ablative, it could mean by the arrival, or it could mean at the arrival, like an ablative time when. And that's probably the best translation here. So at the arrival of them, quorum, at their arrival. And then petiwit means asked for or sought. And there's no noun that could really be a subject to that here. So we just say he asked for, and the object would be breve tempus, a short time. So upon their arrival, or at their arrival, he asked for a short time. Ut, and then it has a subjunctive at the end, daret, so that's in order to give, ut daret. And then the object will be suprema mandata, his final commands, suprema mandata. And then uxori is the dative singular of uxor, so to his wife. And then per litteras, through a letter. And remember, litterai or litteras is plural, but we translate it as singular. To give his final commands to his wife through a letter. Then deinde, and now there's no nominative noun here, so we just take the subject as contained in obtulit, and if you look that up, you'll see it's the perfect tense from offero. So he offered, and then we need an object, which is cervicem, accusative of cervix. So he offered his neck, and then percussoribus. A percussor is an executioner, and here we have dative or ablative plural. And the dative would make sense here because you're offering something to someone. So he offered his neck to the executioners.